Greetings, folks. Just getting back to our streaming after 2 weeks away. 2 weeks ago today was the last stream. Figure we'll get this set up. I'll start the usual chatter. Recovering from a bit of a cold from travel, which I almost always get. Had some real latency issues earlier, so for any reason I dropped, that's the reason why. So here we are back from the tomes. Fox and Board Games, the broadcast and media game development section of the company. So we have, obviously we have Twitch from the tomes. If you're watching us live on Twitch, you know where we're at. Go over to YouTube if you haven't, subscribe there. And the reverse is true. If you're seeing this on YouTube for the first time, one of the archive chats, then please go ahead and check out the Twitch stream if you want to get in on discussions or just chat while I'm working. This is an ongoing series of chats where I produce RPG material and talk about it as I do it. I've been working on my own game, Tales of the Hallowed Land, the core rule book for several years now, but I've actually started streaming all of it recently in advance of the release, hopefully within, by early next year. I'm hoping that I'll have something ready to go. Check out everything on foxandboardgames.com. I'll turn off the talking head here. And we have Twitter and Facebook, Fox and Board Games. And of course, subscribing and liking any of this helps me tremendously. It helps me take this from this thing that I do when I have the time to getting to it and making it a priority. And that includes producing more game stuff, which that's what my aim is to do. I had about 2 weeks off. I did some traveling in Norway for various things. I figure for now I'll put up a picture for the background here. Until I have something else to share with you. So, if you've been watching, you know that I've been going regularly several times a week, and that's my intention to keep going with that. Starting next week, we should be back to our regular schedule, which tends to be at this time Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday for a work stream, and then Wednesday night I usually do a chat where it's kind of a roundtable discussion. I was just a little too out of it and jet lagged last night to push through and start right in with that again. But hopefully we will get back to that next week. That is my goal. And for those of you who are tuning in, of course I also have archived streams. If you go to the video on demand section, most of my old streams have dropped off already after 2 weeks, but the video on demand section, the highlights, you can see most of the past streams there, or of course go over to the YouTube channel. So I've been getting a little more activity on YouTube recently, and it would be really great if I could get that going. So every time I run one of these streams, I have usually 20 to 30 people pop in throughout the course of the two or so hours that I stream. And I think only 10% of those folks subscribe. And obviously, if what I'm doing isn't your thing, that's fine. Please don't subscribe if you don't like it. But if you're all interested, go ahead and follow me here or subscribe over on YouTube. That will really help me get to where I want to be in terms of making this a part of my ongoing process and vocation as a game developer, pen and paper game developer. Interesting discussions with some folks while I was overseas. Ran into one fellow who's not only a very good guitarist, but he's also a programmer. And he's interested in working in some capacity to bring some digital aspect of some of what I'm doing to life. And that'd be kind of cool. I'm trying to get this background up for you. It's not backgrounding. That's really annoying. So where are we at today? Well, I'm always a little reluctant to do this. I'm not quite sure how to work on potential game content. I've seen a couple people do it, a couple really good streams of people doing it. And I'm not quite sure how to manage that without giving away stuff in terms of the game content. So, that's been kind of a quandary of mine. Now, you could argue that, first of all, most people who come on and play one of these games in a playtest capacity or whatever aren't even going to necessarily remember what I talked about when I was working on the game, and that there will not be enough context for them to go, oh yeah, I remember what this guy was doing with this game. I know the secret to this story. I can navigate this module without much effort. But at the same time, it's kind of weird, especially because, a lot of my regular players tune in. And it's kind of strange that I'm sitting there going, yeah, well, in this part of the scenario, they're going to be attacked by this or whatever. I think, well, yeah, I just gave that major part of it away. I guess we're going to find out. A lot of people have asked me about my story development process. And that's actually something that people have requested that I talk about. So I guess we'll find out. I guess we'll find out how that's going to work. I guess I'll just start out with a brief view of how I usually start this process. A glimpse, if you will, as to how I generally start this process. Oh, now it's showing preview. So, when I was away, I didn't get as much. I thought maybe if I have some downtime, I'll be able to get some notes done, get some writing done for game material. And of course that really didn't happen. We were at a music festival most of the time, and that soaked up this vast amount of the time that I had while I was there. And then around that, we met people, and of course, it was also very much a social outing, as well as just going to a concert and coming home at night and having a couple hours in the morning. So that didn't go quite as I thought, but I did get to take some notes, especially while in transit, on a bus or on a plane, whatever. I did take advantage of the time to actually work on this a little bit. And this is kind of what I have. This is kind of how I work. This is just a screenshot off my phone. These were all notes on my phone. And that's how I started. And this is how I start almost all of my scenarios. Scenario writing is I tend to start by just taking notes. Now, whether these notes are on pen and paper, whether they're on my, my handy dandy iPhone or some other device, a tablet or some other device, I usually start with just these lists of brainstorming notes. This is for the Tales of the Hallowed Land games. My goal is to come up with 3 to 4 scenarios to run online starting in mid-October, and to continue that as part of this evolving process of getting this game company started, is to start GMing a little bit online. And I've got a couple got a couple ideas. I've got one idea for Call of Cthulhu, an idea for my own game, and then probably one idea for D&D, 5th ed, or possibly 2 5th eds. I have several ideas for each of these, but I'm trying to compact them down to things that are going to be manageable in an online environment, and hopefully no more than 12 hours. So figure 3 to 4 game sessions. And we all know that these things take much longer. If you've ever run a game in this format, what I call convention or tournament format, where you have like a really specific set amount of time to do this, you know that it definitely takes far longer to get all this done, or for players to get through something to get it done, than you ever conceive they're going to. And that's just the nature of players, I think, the nature of gaming, I think. So I'm trying to keep these very concise. One of my biggest flaws as a game master is trying to pack way too many ideas into one scenario, one session. And I'm really trying to avoid doing that. I'm trying to make these very single-minded, complete stories. So, let's see where we're at with that. So looking at my notes here, my extensive notes, not just the ones on my phone. So I started out by thinking, okay, what kind of game do I want this to be? And I think that's one of the things that you really have to sit down and define, especially in a format such as running online or running in a consolidated 2 hours and having this kind of this fixed time frame that you're working in, these fixed parameters that you're working in. And the first thing I did is try to decide, like, do I want it to be, how do I want this to flow? Like, what kind of, if people were to make characters for this, what kind of characters would benefit from it? We've talked a lot about stuff like this in terms of session 0 and expectations. And one of the biggest things we keep going back to in all of our chats is, what are the expectations on the part of the game master for what the players are going to do, how they're going to handle this. Now, obviously, the difference between this and a video game is that it's open-ended, right? Players can decide they're going to handle this in any way they want to. Whether they're going to be successful or not is a totally different discussion. But I like to break it down. Okay, so what's the nature of this scenario? Is 50? So I broke this down to 50% investigation, 30% social, 20% combat. And investigation is also exploration. And this is a good thing. I'm thinking that from now on, obviously, if I have, a set group, they kind of know what to expect from me. But if I'm sitting down cold with a group, I think I'm going to throw this out there and put this right at the top of any description of a scenario, any description of an adventure, where I just say, okay, 50% of this, you can expect characters that are good at investigation, exploration to excel. 30% of the activity might be social interaction. 20% might be combat. Versus the long-term campaign that I ran, where I would say it was 60% exploration, investigation, overland travel, and then probably 30 or maybe even 50%, then maybe 35% combat, and the remaining 15% social interaction. Having deeply social characters wasn't particularly the focus, which doesn't mean people couldn't play them, and they did play them, but it really wasn't the same thing as a politically based story or adventure. So that's kind of where I start out. Then I just have some notes, and I came up with Mystery at the Baths was my first thought, which was, I guess, kind of offbeat. I forget. I think I might have thought of that when we were in the archaeological exhibit at the Penn Museum last month, and we had a whole discussion about, the various ancient bath cultures, and that these were also, bathing was also a social event, not just a perfunctory event. But group bathing was a thing that was not considered odd. But it's some sort of mystery, like someone's dead with, parts missing or something at one of the baths. And baths, of course, were also stratified by class, so this would be something high class. And then maybe it's a famous gladiator. And then the players would probably be under the employ of somebody, maybe the noble whose property this bath is on, or some other shoe-in. We always have to have an obligatory kind of shoe-in for the players, especially in a fixed scenario. You can't really expect a bunch of random players to just jump in and become entirely invested in this particular game. But then, of course, as they investigate that, other odd things start happening. Like they find another, maybe they can investigate and find out this has been linked to some other event, and they're going to find that there are 4 related incidences that provide a clue to the end result. And the end result is that somebody, maybe a political rival of the first guy, is behind this and is using these things or body parts or talismans that he's been taking off, and I haven't decided what yet, to somehow use a spell or a curse or something. And I also come up with some aspects of like ancestral curses, and again, I want this to not only provide a few hours of entertainment, but bring people into this world and this story and give them a task to solve, but make them feel immersed in the culture. And we talk a huge amount about that. So that's kind of where I'm leaning with something like that. That's kind of my first step. In how to start doing this. What's the next step? The next step is to actually start taking notes, which is what I'm going to do now. My first day back, I feel like I kind of broke my rhythm in terms of I had kind of a regular group of people who were stopping in to chat. I think it's going to be quieter today as I'm just getting back to it. So, get this all set up here. There's my handy dandy notepad. So where do I want to start with this? Well, I guess the first thing is to just dictate what it is, right? First thing is to save the document, right? That's the first thing you always want to do. We're going to put this. We'll drop this right into Excuse me. Arrange this by list. Folder, let's call this playtest scenario 2 because I don't have a name for it yet. And call this I think I did a little review of something similar to this when I went over one of my Call of Cthulhu games that I ran last year. I showed the breakdown of how I had arranged my content, how I'd organized my content. I think it's also kind of funny that, I had a discussion with Bill, one of my colleagues and gaming friends, who his kid is just starting a scenario, a D&D game with a group of friends, all theater kids, and they're playing this very freeform, almost diceless game. And we were all joking, like, because even though we're pretty role play heavy, most of us are not like super type A role players, but we're also not combat monsters. But we were like, wow, we were like, they would just our group would just be like this group of like thugs coming into their game, because we're not micromanaged or anything, but we still have a very different. We're not diceless, just purely theater of the mind's eye. But I just think it's interesting how many, and I've said this before, how many different types of people play these games now and have different reasons. And for that reason, I think it's extra important to define up front what the story is about. So I'm actually going to hide this for the moment while I'm typing. I don't know. I guess I won't, because I know people like to see that. So let's just say So I think just establishing a couple things up front is important. And this seems really obvious, but I've noticed it's not. You know, the runtime 10 to 12 hours. So you figure each, if this is going to be primarily for online game sessions, we're going to have probably 3 to 4 sessions, right? Maybe more. Maybe more. I mean, I've said my kind of optimum time frame is a focused 2.5 to 3 hours in an online scenario. I think more than that, people tend to get a little lost in the shuffle. They tend to get distracted. Of course, this entirely depends on the group, but that's been my experience. So I don't think there's anything wrong with making these things a little bit longer. And then if you know people wrap it up more quickly, or if they really want to go for another session, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And I try to establish a theme right up front, you know, or a, let's say, an overview. Let's look at the percentages again, though. So I'm thinking this is going to be 50%. So let's not get a 40% investigation exploration. So characters that have skills that or abilities that benefit their investigative or explorative skills, not to mention, of course, players with an interest in doing that, will be advantaged in this particular scenario. Or let's say, if you tell a player, well, if you like investigation and exploration, you're going to like this game, then at least there is this chance that they're going to enjoy it and that they're going to come back for the rest of the scenario. They're going to feel like they and their characters are excelling. So then let's say I want to go 30% social interaction. And by that, I don't just mean asking the bartender who's been in recently. I mean, that's kind of this almost, if this were an old school game, you'd have a macro. Ask bartender for information, right? That's not necessarily social interaction. But let's say you have to talk to a series of people in depth to get a clue. And that you have to really role play and really try to dig into what the motives of individual characters are, NPC characters are, to somehow excel. And there are definitely players who enjoy that kind of thing, and then there are definitely players who don't really like that kind of thing. And I think it should be upfront, what to expect. And then maybe I'll say 30% combat, but my vision for this scenario isn't necessarily that it's going to be extremely combat heavy. But I think the combat that's going to be there is going to be important. And I think that's a really strong differentiation. D&D tends to be, for example, in most games, really 70% combat focused. The entire game's built around challenges and overcoming the challenges with your character abilities. Not necessarily overcoming them through other means like social interaction or exploration or anything like that. Not to say you can't, because I've run and played entire D&D game scenarios where there's very little combat. But the game itself is so focused around those sorts of systems. So, let's see, overview. Now, again, how do you get players involved? Are they hired? I mean, that's kind of the standard, right? But that would depend on the player characters and the nature. If this is built into a larger campaign, this could feed into a larger campaign. If it's a one shot, there's a lot of assumptions and some railroading that could be made, put into play really early on to kind of force the characters into this scenario. So overview: players are in a royal bath. I'm assuming at this point the crime in question will be a strange murder. I haven't really dug too deeply into it yet, but that's kind of the thought that I had. Brings opponent out gladiator. Actually, this is just fun for the overview. And they don't want to overdo it with your overview. You don't want to give everything away in your overview. Change one to royal bath. That leads to a web of political machinations and intrigue. So it's basically, I'm establishing right there that it's a very, intrigue and almost detective-like focus of the game. That it's not necessarily going to be about, muscling your way through and fighting everything you meet. Now, of course, how individual players choose to resolve this is an entirely different discussion. Some groups will do things that you obviously do not expect. Let's see. So the other thing you can do is fairly early on come up with your setting and a cast of characters. So these missing pieces fit into a much larger puzzle. Ominously. Insert ominous music there. So I think the other thing we need to figure out is where this is going to take place. So I think this is going to be city focused. And will it just remain in one city, or will the characters be going overland? That's a whole discussion as to how I want to present it later. But as of now, I'm thinking it's mostly going to take place in one geographic area, one city. And probably largely one part of a city. Though, of course, sending the players to different locales could provide some interest as well. So some scene change options. So I'm thinking that the city that it's going to be set in is going to be Magerlen, which is the capital. Oh well, it's yeah, capital's it's the prominent enduring culture in the region, and I believe I've talked a little bit about it before. Pull up a document for that. So Magerlen is one of the most populous cities, if not the most populous city. And it's the city that has this very Babylonian feel. It's got these sprawling gardens and these ziggurats and these kind of very urbanized areas for this sort of culture and time period. Sandstone, white rock, risers that create this kind of leveled city, pathways that go under low stone buildings. And this is the whole center area where the noble houses and the temples are. And then beyond that, of course, it sprawls out. And it's this vibrant, kind of ancient urban complex that is ruled over by this order, the Blazu Razed, which is a cultic order that is thousands of years old, and they've maintained strong political hold over the city, as well as governing nearly all of their interactions, their religious interactions. And while there are worships of various gods and various house temples and all these kinds of things, they are kind of the final word in most of what goes on in this city. So then the question starts to come in: well, are they going to bump up against the players? Are they going to be involved in this, or are they still going to be part of the backdrop? I haven't really decided yet. So there's the kind of outland area outside of the merchant ring, the Boksa, which is the trash, and that's where people who, are cast out or are extremely impoverished or outsiders or don't fit into the city's strict caste system go. This is where they're sent to dwell. So, it might be interesting to send the players there too, right? The seedier side of the city, where even the Blazer Azed does not have this really strong hold. So I'm really kind of fascinated with the burial practices of ancient cultures. Some of you know a good deal of what I did in Norway was spent time in and around ancient burial mounds, early Iron Age burial mounds. and I've read a lot about the grave practices of ancient culture. So I want to incorporate that somehow. The richest people there are the of in this particular city in the Rubari culture, there are funerary cylinders. There are these great ceramic cylinders into which their corpses are placed, and they desiccate and decompose within these cylinders very quickly because of the collected heat in these ceramic cylinders. And this is actually not totally fantastic. As far as there being great ceramic cylinders, I haven't found a culture specifically that does that. But if you look at the above ground crypts in New Orleans, for instance, they basically act like ovens historically. In the heat of New Orleans, they would basically cook down the remains long term. Not an inflammatory cremation, but a long term decay. Maybe I should put a content warning on this, right? Content warning. Grisly stuff. But there are the Mrastoya, the untouchables, the invisible people, the lowest caste, who do all the things that are not that nobody wants to do in the city. The very few, if no, rights within Margaret land, but at the same time, they do carry on all these really important functions, and they have this kind of internal culture. So I'm thinking they have a bog burial, because right outside the city are these kind of swampy areas that lead up to the coast. And I'm thinking that I want this to somehow incorporate into it. I want one of these bog burials to hold one of the clues to this story. And I don't have all the pieces fully connected yet. And I'll probably in the coming weeks flip between this topic and the world building. Though this I could argue is world building too, because the story is how the player interfaces with the world, right? That's how they see the world. How you show them what you've been writing behind the scenes is through their character's point of view and interaction. So it'd be kind of cool to incorporate that. But they're kind of put into these boggy, these kind of bog houses, these kind of vegetation, constructed vegetation, local vegetation and mud, dirt houses, and the dead are deposited in there. And they put flowers and incense and all these other stuff. But there are festivals there where it's, over holidays where you go out to see your dead relatives, which we know is not uncommon in several parts of the world, and most parts of the world. And they become these kind of festive places. It's this kind of constant chilly village of the dead that is rumored to possibly be haunted. So I'd like one of the clues to the story, and I kind of don't want to give away the entirety of the plot here in this, because if I do that, then anyone who might want to play this later is not going to be surprised. There's no mystery. The word wealth here. So I think the first thing to do is possibly, now that I'm kind of reviewing this, is to go back to the note document and start kind of locking down my overall story, my overall plot. We got a few viewers who are quiet today. Thanks for tuning in. Feel free to say hi or don't. It's a busy week. I know a lot of my viewers are college age, and I know that things have gone full steam ahead for some of you. And so this isn't an isolated crime. And I'm not showing you the document I'm typing on because I think it would be counterproductive to getting this scenario out there, at least while it's at this state. So the first thing you kind of have to establish is the motive, right? The underlying story and why things are even happening. And I like, and I've learned from experience, both writing for RPGs and writing for fiction, that you generally want to actually have a conclusion in place. You don't want it to be a case like in many popular movies and books where you kind of get to the end, you think this person had no idea what they were going to do with this, did they? And I've unfortunately found that kind of endemic. So let's see. Let's do a quick search here. As I always joke around, if you're watching me work, 2/3 what you see me doing is Googling and flipping between documents to try to find things. That's a weird Google. I won't tell you what it is. Yeah, that's not the one I'm looking for. I'm familiar with that one. I'm looking at mythological creatures that would fit this context. So, as most of you know, there's not a lot of, in this game, this world, Tales of the Hallowed Land, there isn't a lot in terms of monsters. You know, the focus of the game is not finding and hunting and killing monsters. Creatures of supernatural or inhuman makeup tend to serve a very specific social function, much more like our current our real world mythological landscape. And that's not to say I haven't come up with some cool things, creatures, but I don't tend to just make up a weird creature and throw it in there, right? What's the old joke? The wizard, the mad wizard's creation in D&D, right? Everything from the owl bear to the flump or whatever. Is this a creation of a mad wizard? So I'm trying to find something that would fit, that I could adapt into this scenario. A being that would make sense. Well, all right, that suddenly looks like it fits the bill. Let me copy this and do a search specifically for this creature. No, that's not what I was looking for. This is not the weird creature you're looking for. Oh, well, I guess it... Oh, I see. All right. I am familiar with this being. I just didn't know that was the term for it. Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking it would be. I mean, I could come up with this. I could just make this creature to have a distinct vision of what it's going to be like and what the role is going to be in this scenario. Well, I can get back to that, right? I guess I should maybe plot out a little bit more in terms of the story itself. Right up the backstory. I think if I get to the point that I have multiple stories going, multiple scenarios I'm writing, showing you kind of the back content notes isn't as big of a deal. But I guess I should share it. There's kind of what I have broken down so far. So now the backstory. I'm trying to think how to relate this without being too specific and giving stuff away. Of course, I'll go fill this in. I'll go fill this in a little bit more later. I don't have names for all the periphery NPCs yet either. So I want to incorporate some sort of curse, the idea of a curse into this too. So maybe I want to actually... I go back to Googling again. Character creation document. Our favorite document that I've been working on diligently. Come up with some names. The naming convention for this culture, the Rubari, I believe I said it was rooted in Bulgarian. Yes. So this gets complicated because it's this society is very caste driven. So I have to first of all decide what caste this is going to revolve around. So it would make the most sense that it would be the Oki caste. And the Oki are the nobles and politicians. Both hereditary nobles, politicians. And it even involves other prominent figures. Sometimes there's an overlap, obviously, between this caste and the Rukaz caste, which are the vast population of workers. They are warriors, craftspeople. Obviously, if there is a really wealthy merchant family, even if a bulk of the family are workers, craftspeople, a small majority of them will also be probably of noble, or have attained enough status to be of noble blood. So I'm thinking they would probably be the Oki caste. So I have my little naming chart here. Let's always refresh this window. It's very frustrating. Not sure why. Alright. Now refresh it. So here's the Oki cast, and so they have some naming conventions based on each cast. Like Adalma, Ginish, Ren, Coffee. What I found interesting about the Bulgarian naming conventions, not based on our real world, is that depending what time period they come from, they span everything from Slavic to Romanized. So it's actually a really broad list of names that I could draw in from. Now, a lot of searches give you very contemporary names, and almost all contemporary cultures have a lot of Christianized names versus their original ethnic names. So it's actually sometimes a little difficult to sort this out. And due to our migrations, our real world migrations, say a census in Bulgaria now will reveal a very different set of names than would have been around maybe 2,000 years ago. Radiva, that's a nice family name, isn't it? Has a nice ring. So the Radiva family will be in control of this estate. Now, Baths, and maybe they were the family who, I don't know. This gets complicated because if I were to draw you a tree of how I'm envisioning it, which I can do. There's the centralized. Oh, not that I'm typing that in there, right? I like flowcharts too. I often deal with flowcharts. I think my extra drive with all my stuff is upstairs. I'll grab that in a minute. Let's jump over to Google Draw. Everyone's favorite, Google, for everything. Let's see. So Google Draw, so the way I'm envisioning it. Something like the start of the scenario. We have, so bathhouses are public, so there's an event in a bathhouse. Like I said, probably a murder or something like that. And I wanted it to be a bathhouse because it would be something that would be public. It would be harder to necessarily find evidence or get away with something versus if it had been in a private estate. Now, it also gives more opportunity for witnesses. So I can break down the reasons why I would choose to have it at a public bath. So I would think something like, more easily killed when bath and unaware. All right, relaxed. Assumes safety. Probably no weapons right at hand. For the same reason mobsters kill each other when they're eating dinner, right? In restaurants, the trope of the Godfather and Sopranos and countless other movies is wiping out an enemy mobster while they're coming out of dinner or eating dinner. They're in a state where they're, even if they're in public, there's this assumption that they're going to be more relaxed. And they might have their guard down a little bit. Killing somebody in a very public manner in something like a historic bathhouse is also a statement. There's no reason to hide the crime, right? I mean, these are all the things that players are going to go through and think of. And as I said in the beginning, the breakdown of this is that's going to be largely exploration and investigation oriented. So it's going to be a statement. So they can assume that whoever committed this crime doesn't care about people knowing about it. But this also begs another question. Who did this publicly and got away with it? Where there are potentially a lot of... Where there are witnesses. Where I risk that. So this, of course, the players should probably start thinking in terms of victim know each other. So this could be your first clue, right? This could be their very first step as to how to go about and start evaluating the scenario that I'm going to present to them. Did the killer and the victim know each other? That's going to be kind of the crux of it. Did they? I haven't even necessarily, as the author, fully decided yet. But I'm going to assume that it would also allow a stranger to get close to a victim. Right? That in these kind of public spaces, somebody in ancient history coming into a bath, sitting next to you and starting to chat with you, though this might seem completely alien to our modern sensibilities, it wouldn't be that weird in the ancient world. In fact, I bet if I look up historical murders in bathhouses, I bet I'm going to find a ton. Let's try it. Bath, living late antiquity. To be murdered in a bath meant you were accessible in a bath. So bathing was not the private. So this again, here we have the first Google reveals a search that talks about the crux of this particular scenario. In fact, I think we will copy that. As I've pointed out, so I've actually been in the ruins of Roman baths, both big and small. And yeah, they're huge, first of all. Like, we don't really have a concept, unless you've been in one, what it's like to be in one. So it appears that the public baths were part of a civil works, a public works. Not unlike a city putting out public restrooms or whatever public facility today. So some other things to take note. Goes to a victim. Let's call this just first flow chart. So do I do this with all of my stories when I begin creating one? All my scenarios when I begin creating one? Generally, yes. Something like this. Now, obviously there are variants. D&D tends to be a lot more straightforward, D&D 5th ed, until it gets to the meatier parts of the campaign. Yeah, the first couple scenarios where it's just, orcs have raided this village, go kill them. Obviously those sorts of introductory things, at least initially, are much more straightforward. And I tend to not necessarily put this level of detail and research into it because, it's orcs. It's not something we have to think so much about. But, for example, later on in our D&D game, there was quite a bit of intrigue in this merchant. They had to transport this merchant caravan basically across the lower half of Greyhawk into the dangerous territories on the western edge or the eastern edge of the Great Wastes, and then when they get to this one particular castle held by these corrupted lycanthropic nobles, then there was a lot more of this kind of charting as to who does what, who does who, who's going to kill who when, and who you have to watch out for in this castle, because they were in this castle for several game sessions, and they knew things were bad when they got there. They knew there was something off when they got there, and they just had to try to sort out and decide who was dangerous, who was not, who could be an ally, who could not. So then there was a lot more of this type of stuff. Now again, D&D is not, there's no onus to historical authenticity, so I didn't really worry so much about it. Obviously the noble and this whole clan were werewolves, so right there I've kind of taken this idea of worrying about accuracy and throwing it out the window. But for this setting, which is quasi historically rooted in our own ancient world, even if it's a fantastic version of it, I like to get some of these things in order and semi-realistic. So one note here is that public baths see if it says it in this little article that I'm taking a look at now. So here's actually the Emperor Constans II was murdered in a bath in Daphne, murder in a bath complex named Daphne, in the town of Syracuse, Sicily. And it says right here exactly that this particular emperor was murdered in a bath because he was the most accessible there. That's where his assassins, which was a rival, which, obviously, if I'm setting this story up that there was a murder in a bathhouse, there's a rival. There's some nefarious undercurrent here that would cause this crime. Interesting. The whole ritual around Roman bathing. Now, again, I'm not sure how this worked in other areas of the world. Let's see. Yeah, so ancient Mesopotamians did too. And again, it's really until our modern era that this idea of these public works baths are kind of alien. Trash and toilets in Mesopotamia, just what we wanted to know, right? So as I've described, that this world that this game is set in, particularly this region of this city, I describe it as kind of an emerging fertile crescent, in this case, this particular part of the continent's more established. This fertile crescent type society that has a fairly sophisticated culture. Interesting. We're never taught that the Mesopotamians had running water and indoor toilets, right? Again, our concept of ancient people tends to be very skewed. Studio work, man? Oh. Yeah, so let's go back. Wow. So this is a public bath. In fact, this is fairly equivalent to the landscape of, well, this is Egyptian. This one I believe is possibly the most house in the world. So of course our real, you know, vision of ancient baths comes from the Romans, but apparently they were common in Grecian and earlier cultures as well. Interesting. So ancient Indus Valley. All right. So we know that there was a public bath culture there. So it's not out of place to have a history of plumbing in Babylon, right? This is why some writers never get anything done. They go down these rabbit holes. It's 2 a.m. and they still haven't written anything. So, baths are public works. So there are, for the extremely wealthy, private baths. Now, I've already established that the victim of this particular crime is probably going to be a gladiator, a famous gladiator who maybe is owned by a particular house, or but does not necessarily have access to the private baths of the nobility. So they would have to use a public bathroom. So it's a public work, so it's kind of public territory. So then the question becomes the usual sets of discussion. We have the where, when, who, and now we need the why, right? So now we need the relationship. This person was not killed in an itinerant fashion. This was not a crime of opportunity. There was distinct reason why this person was killed, and it's because something on this person was from this person's body was required. And I think it's going to be a body part, and I haven't decided which yet. If it's an organ or if it's they need the hand of a great warrior or something like that. I haven't quite decided that yet. Of course, there's all kinds of options here. Alright, so if I go back to the backstory, which I'm going to write here. I have all these different threads that I'm trying to pull together. Kind of the opinion is going to be on this murder and a series of other events that relate to this. So it's going to center around the Radiva family. Now I'm trying to determine if the Radiva family are going to be the victims, so I think they're going to be perhaps so I guess the heroes will be under the employ of the Radiva family. So the question is it their gladiator who was killed? I really want to work in a family curse. Of some sort. And how the curse fits into this murder. I haven't quite formulated that yet. Maybe I should take the curse and put that aside for either another story or some component of this story. Because as I said, one of my goals is to create something that can be finished in a focused fashion. And I've learned from my own experience that if I get too many threads going on, I end up with this kind of conglomerate of ideas that players are trying to grasp at to figure out what to do next. And having played games long enough, I know sometimes the worst thing that can happen is the game master just staring at you like why haven't you guys finished this yet? And in reality, it's because maybe you didn't have the proper direction. Maybe you just didn't have that little thread of direction that you needed to say, go here and do this. And all of us are like these, we like to be these clever beings that think like, oh, well, they can figure this out. My players are smart. They're invested enough in this. But in the end, what you realize is that often you have to give just a little bit more in terms of the clue, the direction, all these other things. So if we go back to this, some questions. Is this gladiator's role particularly important who they belong to. Do they have to be? Or are the baths perhaps owned by this family? And does that factor into it? So the subtext is, of course, to enact this curse or this revenge, they needed to kill this person and get something from them. And what's going to be found is there are several other murders or events that need to be followed to prevent or enact some spread of this effect. And again, I'm trying not to say too much, because until this is played and run a few times, I don't really want to give it away. So I think the Rediva family. I think if we go back now to this. So I've got a pretty complex set of events in my mind already. And it involves what has to be done for this revenge to take place. And it's a series of steps that the person attempting to complete this revenge is following. And I haven't yet decided if the goal is for the players to follow that trail to an endpoint or to try to head off the endpoint and prevent it. Again, it's almost more efficient if the players head off and prevent it, and it might be quicker than kind of following the trail and having a seat at the end. Having them be the proactive element instead of the passive element. I'll take a quick break. And I shall be back. So, trying to tie it all together. And that's always the hardest part. You're going to have these images, these bits of what you think is going to happen in these things. And then you sit and you think, well, is this, this is actually how it's all going to fit together. How are the players going to track this and trace this and all these other things? And sometimes you have to simplify it. And this is what I've run into recently, is I've had to simplify midway to make it work. And I think simplifying it to start really helps. So I think the if-then statements start to come in now. Well, actually, the if-then statements come in later. I think now we just need a list of events. I'll put down some ideas. All right, some ideas, and then here I'll put down basically just a... This is all tentative, of course, because it can all change, and a single type, a single moment of typing. Oh yeah, maybe I'll do it this way. Now, I hear a lot about players and GMs taking the winging it approach. On one hand, I think that's absolutely fine. I like to actually have a framework, and then if I have to adjust within that. So the basic order would be find some clue indicating maybe if a player has a specific knowledge, this particular body part removed in this fashion could say, oh, well, this is known for this. So, I mean, the first thing that players really would tend to do then is go into recent interactions and background, right? Who was the last person to see him? Who was seen coming and going from the bath? This is the point where you, as the overseer, as I call it in this game, or the storyteller, or keeper, or game master, or dungeon master, how many clues do you want to give right off the bat? Well, I've already said I want this to be concise, right? I don't want this to be something that it takes players months to solve. I would like them to, within 10 minutes of investigating the scene, have some kind of lead. So maybe somebody was seen leaving the bath. Or seen entering beforehand, right? Either one. Either one will do. Some characteristic. One metal eye. How about that? One metal marble for an eye. Should I read that demonstrative? That'd be notable, right? They'll already come up with all these nicknames for this guy. Metal eye. Marble eye. I actually ran into somebody like that. years ago in a punk rock club. It's this dude there with this mohawk, bright orange mohawk and spikes. He was missing an eye. He had just like this metal marble for an eye. It was pretty crazy. He kind of looked like a Warhammer character, a living Warhammer character. My one friend was like, that guy's going to give me nightmares now. I'm like, well, it's certainly jarring. Let's see. I don't know if the middle eye is going to stick. I mean, that's really noticeable. Of course, maybe this person's a famous assassin, right? Eye to a locale. Meet him or his employer, right? Who's behind the man with the metal eye? His employer. Or even his abode, and find other clues. Now, see, I've narrowed it down quite a bit from my original idea. My original idea was not going to be this concrete, and they were going to have to wait for more events to occur. The problem I found with that is that players get bored, and they feel like they're not the active component. You know, they feel like, well, the timer's going to have this new event spring up, and they're going to react to it. And I think the key is whether or not you want your players to have a reactive or an active experience. And I find most players really want an active experience. They don't just want to sit around and wait for something else to happen and respond to it. And I think a lot of stories end up falling into that trap. Other clues indicate. Do they meet the man with the metal eye there? That's a good question. Do you want an early confrontation in which the players have to resolve this? think finding a series of clues could be the most interesting. Other clues, and this is one of a series of crimes. So here's where we start to come up with our possible pathways, right? Like, will or will they go and try to find out so preemptive or establishing a motive? I mean, those are kind of the two paths the players will have at that point. This is a really good start. This is much further along with this idea than I was with just the notes that I showed at the very beginning on my phone. So I think then here we have to determine, is there going to be a sense of urgency? I mean, they find a list. Find a list of basically, it looks like an ingredient list. What's he doing with this ingredient list? Is he making soup? And is there a sense of urgency to find out what is happening with? No. To move to prevent other crimes, subsequent crimes, subsequent deeds, because they're not all actually going to be crimes, deeds. So, I mean, when the players, once they have this, what are they going to do with it? Are they going to try to find this stuff? Are they just going to try to find this guy and prevent him? You know, my original idea was that the players had to get a hold of this list and then go through and try to preemptively secure these items to prevent this person from getting them. But I'm not sure if that's more interesting or less interesting than them trying to figure out what he's going to do with it and where to find him. Maybe I should save that. No, there are other choices in here. How difficult is it to find this guy or his abode? Like, how much of the story is that going to be? Are you going to have this be a case where the players have to make a lot of rolls, they have to talk to a lot of people? Will one of them have an area knowledge and know who this person is, or if they're connected to the underworld, do they know who this person is and where to find them? And do they find, you know, what's the benefit of having them confront this person early on? Maybe realize he's part of some larger plot. Is he the terminal antagonist? or is he just part of a larger plot? And these are all things that really shift how extensive this story is going to be. And again, a lot of this is going to be dictated by whether or not you want it to be something that goes on for weeks or hours. And well, what should I say? That goes on for, 10 hours or goes on for 20 hours. Because the one thing I've learned is that players will almost always make things a longer and more involved process than what they necessarily need to be, self included. Sometimes I've dragged out a scenario for half hour when I could have just resolved it by going, oh, we should just, broke into that place, or whatever. Find a list of ingredients. The sins are actually required to move to prevent subsequent deeds, or are they done? And at what point is the motive reveal? Or is it part of the ongoing plot and determining which course of action to take? Do they go back and talk to House Ravita and realize they are aware of this person's identity? I don't know. I mean, these are all things that we want to consider in terms of playability, in terms of how extensive do we want to make this. Because once you start getting into, okay, well, do they go talk to the house? And then do they go back and, have to kind of preemptively trace all this? That's kind of becomes almost whole subroutine, right? If we want to think of these story developments in terms of programs, then if they get to this point and there's this whole subroutine that they have to go through to finish it, is that what you want as the person running this story? Is that a valuable experience for you and your players? Does it then become a mini campaign? And I always go back and reference the Call of Cthulhu game I ran, the Down Darker Trails game I ran, that kind of motivated this podcast or this video cast initially to start talking about that. Was, I eventually realized what I had created was a mini campaign. It wasn't just an encapsulated story like I thought. So you have to kind of pare down, like, what's the encapsulated story that you want to tell? You want to fit it into a concise environment. If you have this ongoing running campaign, then if the players want to spend 6 weeks, 3 to 4 hours a night on this, that's great. But I'm designing this, I want to design this to be something that's completed in 12 hours. So I have to kind of stage the information rollout. I mean, the goal will be to get them to move, right? We'll get them to move on the idea. We'll get them to move on the clues. But the question is, are they trying to prevent, to get the clues or the things of interest or the people of interest first and prevent an event? Or do they realize that this event's already in progress and they have to move to stop it? And quandary, let's call it. So if you notice, I haven't even mentioned what the event is. No, I'm not going to, because that's kind of the opinion of the scenario. What exactly is going on here and why these things are necessary. That's a major part of the scenario, and that's what I'm not going to give away here today. Maybe once it's been played a few times. So this is for the scenario which I intend to run with both my in-person group and an online group. I'm gonna look at probably around October now for one of those. By the time I actually get it done, but it's already it's getting there. The good thing about Tales is that like making NPCs is very easy. Constructing the challenge levels of the scenario is kind of built in, so it's not doesn't take a lot of scenario design like say staging a giant battle in Warhammer or Fantasy Roleplay or Dungeons and Dragons or anything like that. It's actually fairly simple to construct the encounters once you know what's going to happen. The story should be the focus, and I kind of always emphasize that. This is all about what kind of story you want to tell. I think that's a good place to leave it for today. As I said, this was just kind of a get back into the swing of it. I'm still very jet lagged, so I'm a little spaced out today. Probably you probably didn't notice it any more than you would normally notice me being spaced out. So next week we'll resume with our full schedule. We'll resume with our Monday and Tuesday streams, and of course our Wednesday night topical stream, which I have not decided on yet. I've got a couple ideas floating around. So probably Monday I'll get back to the character development chapter of the game, revisit that over the weekend, see where I'm at with that, as I partially don't, I remember where I was at with it, but I don't remember the last thing that I worked on with it. Of course, not like it's a really difficult. I'm going to save this document and close it, and there I have my fun little flowchart. Talks a little bit about public baths. Okay. Maybe I'll just copy those notes out. So when I design a scenario, I do indeed go through all of these kinds of note-taking steps. Like if you look at some of my other stuff, let me actually reopen that document. Sorry. If you look at my other documents for story development, you'll find a lot of like links right in the notes document. And that's really just so I have something to go reference later. Everything I just typed into that little Google flowchart. We can know each other, the environment allows lore. So those kinds of things about like how we find that article on Mesopotamian baths. Again, I love doing this because I learn things. I feel like I learn a lot more writing games like this than something that is purely fantasy and divorced entirely from our reality. I'll put this link too. Doesn't cost anything to copy a link. So this goes all to all our talk of backstories, right? At what point does it matter to the players how much backstory you put into it? And again, I go back to what I always say, that I feel that the more detail and work you put into really establishing the environment, establishing motive, establishing details that make it realistic, the more your players will benefit from it, and they will interact and react to that, whether they know it or not. I don't think it's. I think it's about an immersion to a degree. The more realistic you make it, the more grounded you make it, at least with an internal logic, the less kind of cliched it will seem. Well, that's it, folks, for today. Thanks a lot for watching. I've had a few watchers. Quiet chat today, which is okay. Not every chat is going to be as active as some of them, but I'm hoping to get back to the swing of it. So we'll go back to the usual end of broadcast diatribe. So, From the Tomes is a product of Fox and Boar Games, Twitch. Join in on the chats, subscribe and follow. YouTube, watch the archive videos. You can also see them here for a period of time. Find everything at foxandboargames.com. Twitter, Facebook, at Fox and Boar Games. Probably should get an Instagram going too. And please like, subscribe, and follow to any and all of these if you like what you see here today. And if you happen to not like what you see here today, feel free to give me feedback too. Don't be afraid to give me some thoughts. Give me your thoughts. I always like to hear what people would like to see more of, like to see less of. But for now, I think we're going to leave that. I'll see you all next week. Thanks for tuning in. Have a good one.